First, to my left, your right, Arturo Rosario from Milan, Italy. He teamed with Brian Redmond in Ferrari 312s, Mario Andretti in the 312s, drove 512 Ferrari, ran 85 Formula 1 races, scored 11 points in the World Championship, and in sports cars won the Targa Florio and S.p.A. He is also famous for his bravery in reaching in and getting into the burning Ferrari and picking out and lifting him out, and subsequently saving his life. From Milan, Italy, Mr. Arturo Rosario. Next in line is Andy Wallace. Andy was born in the UK. He attended the Jim Russell driving school at age 15. Can you imagine 15 years old going to driving school? He knew what he wanted to do early on. Ran his first race at age 18 in Formula 4 and has been a winner ever since. Winning Le Mans, he won the 24-hour 3 times, and twice the Sebring 12 hours. He had one of the top speeds for the production-based car, the McLaren F1 at Le Mans at 240 miles an hour down the low side. 240, can you imagine? A record that still stands today. He drove the Silk Cup Jags. He's driven for Toyota, McLaren, Panos, and Cadillac. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Andy Wallace.
What they actually had. Panos! Yeah! Andy!
Next, from Augusta, Georgia, Mr. Chip Robinson. Chip started racing early in his career and moved right up into the prototypes early on. He won the Daytona 24-hour with Al Holbert and Derek Bell in a Porsche 962 and the Sebring 12-hour in a Nissan with Ari Leinbach and Jeff Brabham. He was also part of the Group 2014 driving the fabulous XGR5s and XGR7s. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chip Robinson. A Yorkshireman who started his career driving a Morris Traveler. He'd take the windshield out and the doors off the back to race during the weekends, put the doors and windshield back on, and sold mops during the week. His first race was in a Jaguar, moved up through lightweight Jags, and was picked up by John Wire for the Ford GT40s. He's won the Daytona 24-hour 3 times. One that took about 20 years for Porsche to recognize his contribution. He's won 9 road racing championships in his career. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Brian Redmond. Our next panelist is a gentleman who started out rallying, convinced Porsche that the 911 was a car that they should go rallying in. Although they reluctantly gave him a car, he turned around and won the Monte Carlo rally for Porsche in the 911. A week later, he was here at Daytona in the prototypes, winning the Daytona 24-hour in the Porsche 907. He's run Formula 1, World Endurance, Trans Am, and Can-Am. Mr. Vic Elford. Our next guest tonight started out in Rochester, New York, with Kodak. Went racing in Triumph TR3, went to his first driving school in 1961 in Marlboro, Maryland. His career was basically built around racing British Leyland cars, Triumphs, later MGs and Jaguars, and it morphed into one of the most successful racing teams in the United States. He won the very first Trans Am race driving a Dodge Dart, and he was responsible for the whole development of the Jaguar program here in the United States. It gives me pleasure to introduce my friend, Mr. Bob Tullius. Next on the agenda, we've got the, George, let me go back to the studio. Let me go to my notes. I was going to read the Jordan Taylor. Now, these guys are young.
Yeah!
Started racing, Ricky won 7 wins and 10 poles in Wayne Taylor Racing. Runner-up in the Rolex Series in 2010, 2011, and ran the Corvette Dallara. Along with his brother, who's starting in racing also, I'll have to come back to you in a little bit and find out what it's like to not only race against your brother and with your brother, but for your dad. Where did my notes? We'll have excuse me, Sean, we'll come back a little bit. Adam bails me out of this thing. Well, let's start with Arturo. When was the first time you raced here at Daytona?
Sì, la prima volta che io venni da Daytona venne a provare nel 1969 con il 512 Ferrari.
That's what I said.
Ero collega di Mario Andretti, vincitore della recente 500 miglia di Indianapolis nel 1969. Per me fu veramente un onore essere a Daytona la prima volta che venivo negli Stati Uniti correre con Mario Andretti.
First time I was here in 1969, trying the Ferrari 512, and I was teammate with Mario Andretti that just won the 500 in Indianapolis, and so I was very honored to be here as a works factory Ferrari driver.
You had the pleasure of driving with Andretti and with Brian Redmond. You won several events with Brian Redmond, long distance racing. How was it to drive with these two? They had two different driving styles?
Di differenze non è che ce ne sono tutti e due grandi piloti, come ho detto poc'anzi fui onorato di correre con loro che avevano già delle esperienze enormi in campo delle sport prototipo nelle gare di durate. Poi io con Mario corsi a Sebring, ho Kislen più volte e con Brian feci nel 1972 e 73 con la Ferrari 312P dove abbiamo vinto anche S.p.A e siamo arrivati delle volte dei secondi per 9 meccaniche.
He says that actually he does not think there were very big difference between Mario and Brian. They are both great champions, and he has been always honored to pair the cars that he drove with them.
Now you had a situation here one time. Bill France was famous for cross-pollination between sports cars and stock cars. And they would take stock car drivers like Fireball Roberts and put in a Ferrari at Le Mans. He put you in a Dodge Charger here at the Daytona 24 Hour. That was an interesting match.
Certo, fu veramente una grossa soddisfazione per un europeo come me, italiano, essere stato invitato ufficialmente dall'allora Bill France, patron di Daytona Speedway, a correre con macchina americana in una 24 ore che era prettamente una gara per vetture diciamo europee, per cui fui molto onorato. Peccato che alle ultime ore siamo dovuti ritirare, ma eravamo messi in una buonissima posizione e credo di essere stato il primo europeo a guidare una macchina totalmente americana.
Yeah, he has been very honored because at the time it was not very usual to be invited in these kind of races over here, and so when Bill France personally invited him here to race with an American car, he was really pleased. Unfortunately, the race ended not so well because in the last hour they had a problem and they had to retire.
Vorrei sottolineare questo, che oggigiorno mi rammenta di non aver accettato l'offerta di Bill France di trasferirmi qua negli States già nel 1970 per poi svolgere le gare di stock car proprio su qui e sulle piste di Talladega eccetera eccetera.
One of his regrets of his racing career is that he has been offered by Bill France earlier to come here and to race permanently in the United States, but they didn't accept it at the time. But looking back now, maybe it was better if we was going like this.
I apologize when I missed earlier on with Sean Rahal. Sean is one of the young lions here from Georgia, recently with multiple wins in the Circuit of the Americas. Sean, why don't we come down to you since I was misbriefed here. Tell me how you got started and what your goals are in endurance racing.
Well, I actually got started in go-karts at 7, and I grew up, my dad raced in HSR for a long time. And I got my start in cars at 12 at Skip Barber, and we went from there to stock cars, and we now worked our way back into prototypes. Goal would be IndyCar, which which we're pursuing in Indy Lights next year, and hopefully to make it to Le Mans one day. We're running the United Sports Car with 8-Star Motorsports, and I'm hoping to make the transfer to Europe at some point.
Now, you did some dirt track racing, have you, up and around the Atlanta area?
I did a lot of stock car and oval racing, but I've only tested on dirt. I haven't raced on it.
How do you like oval racing?
I love the competition, but I'd say multi-class racing in the United Sports Car and even here at HSR is a lot more difficult. You got to be a lot more heads up in regards to gauging the cars that you're coming up on and that you're getting passed by. So it's two different worlds.
For young folks like you three down there, do you think the future for long-term occupation racing is the oval track, stock car, Indy car?
I don't know. You see Scott Pruitt here still making a living and winning races and sports cars. So I think either way, you're going to have the young fluctuation of people coming in, but it's whatever you've been bred for. You can make the transfer at any other time if you're a really good driver. It's a car, it's 4 wheels, and you have a steering wheel, and we got to figure it out.
Well, thank you very much. I apologize early on. I put it in my notes. Andy Wallace, you're one of the most successful sports car racers I've ever seen. And I've had the pleasure of watching you when you ran the Jags here back in the 80s. Watching the European drivers such as you knife through the field was like watching a ballet. I've never seen a display like that before. What was your first Daytona experience?
Well, you're right about the knifing and talking through the traffic. For me, I really only raced in Europe, and it was a big shock, first of all, to come here and race on high banking. It's completely different to anything I'd experienced before. And also the different classes. What do we have? 3 or 4 classes in those days. But I have to say, the slower cars were quite disciplined in those days. But they needed to be too, because the cars were not very stable on the banking. They were moving around everywhere. So if you saw a gap that was the size of your car, it was difficult to fit through that gap. But after a short while, my biggest feeling of Daytona was just how physical it was against Le Mans. At Le Mans, you've got a lot of long straights. Yes, you've got high speeds, but the actual physical racing here for the car and for the driver is much more difficult. So I think to win this race, you have to be on the top of your game.
So the first time you ever drove on a high bank was here?
It was. I mean, we don't really have anything like that in Europe at all. And, so it's interesting. And of course, we didn't have the floodlights in those days either. So at night, it's completely pitch black. The car's tipped up on its side, and it's such a thrill. It was fantastic. I remember it like it was yesterday.
Well, you had 3 victories here. Is there anyone that stands out in your mind as the most satisfying?
Well, you know what? Anytime you win a race, it's great. There was one that got away, and I'm trying to think. Was it 2000, 2001? And we led the race for so long, and the cars quit before the end. That one I remember because it was a great race. But anytime you can drive, especially if you're driving for a factory, all the preparation that goes into it and the competition, any of the races you win are fantastic.
I know that if anybody who's run a 24-hour race knows that the car's going to break you when it's good in the first 30 minutes.
Well, that's the trouble, isn't it? If you're driving a car that's not very quick, it never breaks. It makes you drive it for the whole 24 hours. But if you're in a really great car, the chances are it might break.
Yeah, I had an opportunity one time to drive in a long-distance race in a terrible car, and no matter how I tried to kill it, I couldn't.
Well, you know what happens actually is the 3 of you drive in the car, and it's maybe wounded, it's not very quick, and all 3 of you want to blow it up. So you only ever see one of your teammates, because one's in the car and 2 of you in the caravan. Every time you get back to the caravan, you go, "Did you break it?" And you go, "No." And you say, "Man, why not?" I said, "Well, I tried everything." And the same thing would happen when the next guy gets back to the caravan, And in the end, it finishes 14th, and you are wasted at the end.
I know one of the most famous ones was the Ferrari 250 LM with Maston and Gregory, and I think it was Jochen and Red. And they were given the car when everybody else had the P3s and P4s. They thought it was a come down that they were driving this 250 LM. So they went out to kill it. And everybody else broke, and at the end of the day, they won in 24 hours. Chip Robbins, what was your background before you got into prototypes? Were you into club racing?
I started out actually as a mechanic on a race team, and then I always wanted to drive, and I thought if I started as a mechanic, I'd get a chance to drive that doesn't work.
Well, you were idealistic.
I was pretty naive. And so I went to driving, so I went to Jim Russell Driving School in Canada, and then pulled the board in the S.p.A. for these, and then went to Super B from there, and then
just leave it.
into the Jag.
From the Super B to the Jag, that was quite a leap of faith on.
On Bob's part, it certainly was. You know, it was a great opportunity for me. It was a big change from a 1,000-pound open car to a 2,000-pound closed car. We were driving for an hour at least at a time. You know, in Super B Navy, you do 35 minutes. So it was a pretty big leap.
Now, your son just finished the season of the British Formula Ford Championship. What's his future, and how are you involved with it?
That was last year he did that, and this year he did it the F2000 series over here, and did well. He finished second in the championship, and we're just trying to get something together for next year. You know, it's always a struggle, but we're working hard at it.
Well, it's tough to come up, I think, through the sports car ranks. It always has been. It was always perceived as kind of a rich guy's sport as opposed to NASCAR, which is up through the bull rings. So what sort of challenges are you facing now? You know, in the face of all this success, what's the next step?
We're going to try to do the IMSA Light Series next year, and we're working on that now and trying to talk to teams and just get a budget together. And it's the same challenges as it always was when I was coming up. You know, you've got to get the right opportunity presented to you that you can take advantage of, and that takes some time.
Ryan Redmond, you won this thing 3 times. One time went unrecognized for about 20 years. Ryan was part of the Gulf 917 team and got the winning. He got to fill in on the winning car, but was not recognized for it for years. His car finished. He's the only man in the history of Daytona to not only finish first but finish second in the same race on the same team. You started out in Jaguar. We started out in the Morris and then in the Jaguars. Your first visit to Daytona, was that with the John Wyer GT40s?
The John Wyer GT40 with the Belgian wonder boy Jackie X, who at that time was 21 years old, and I was 29, and he had twice as much experience as I had. And that race, we'd won the Kyle Army 9R race in November of 1967, and we came here for the next race. Well, in those days, of course, there's no chicane, and I could not go onto the banking flat out. We were 200 miles an hour, and I just couldn't do it. And I even tried holding my knee with my hand to keep my foot on the throttle, flat out. Anyway, after practice, I said to Jackie, can you ask a question? He said, yes. What is it you wish, Brian? I said, are you flat onto the banking? And he just looked at me and he said, yes, but of course. So I said, oh, I thought you probably were. And then he said, but I think that I fly to the moon.
One year there was a 24-hour that was shortened by water in the fuel. Now you were in the BMW 3-liter CSL with Peter Gregg. Peter wasn't much help to you that race, was he?
Well, I actually got a lesson in public relations that weekend because I put the car on pole position, but the headline in the Daytona paper the next morning was Greg wins pole. That's okay. He was a local boy from Jacksonville. So in the race, at about 8 in the evening, I came in and he said, can you carry on? I don't feel very well. Well, the result of this was that he only drove 2 hours. John Fitzpatrick in another BMW broke down and he came in for a couple of hours. And I drove 14 hours out of the 20. And so after the race, I was really tired. And I have a photograph somewhere that shows Peter sitting with his arms around the race queens. He's absolutely immaculate. He's driving with arms like this Jaguar here. And I'm standing on one side. I look like his grandfather. And like my eyes are black and I'm half dead anyway. I get back to the hotel. I get in the bath and I fall asleep. And I wake at 3 in the morning. So the next morning, Jochen Nierpasch, team manager, says, Ryan, you missed the victory dinner. And I said, sorry, Jochen, I was asleep in the bath. He said, well, it's okay. Peter Gregg gave a fantastic speech in which he thanked all the mechanics personally by name in German. I said, that's just great.
You need a good PR guy, right? Your third win was with Bob Harrison and Bobby Rahal in the 935. And you were the disciplined guy in that operation.
Well, we qualified 15th, you know, and Rahal was a young charger, he's up and coming. He comes up to me and he says, Brian, let me get in the car, I can qualify higher than that. I said, leave it. So 1 in the morning, he comes to the trailer, I say, how are we doing? He said, we're leading. I said, Bobby, I thought I told you. He said, we haven't passed a single car, they've all broken down.
Big Helfer. You started out in rally, and you show up here at Daytona in a 907, going straight from basically a stock 911 into a very fast prototype in a strange track you've never driven before. And you win in 24 hours. That had to be a thrill.
Well, it was just exciting. It was okay. Nothing was really very thrilling about it, except at one point, it was rather a strange race actually, because my co-driver was Jochen Nierpasch, and Porsche brought 3 cars which were entered, and then we had a 4th car which we used during the week leading up to the 24 hours as a practice car. And we'd all been bashing round and round and round in the 4th practice car, and when it came to start the race, it was still running. And so there were the 3 team cars, and Porsche said, well, the 4th car is still running, let's watch it and enter it in the race as well. So that also did the race. During the race itself, it actually got quite exciting, because in the middle of the night, as we came through, as Brian said, there were no lights. The only lights were just here through the trioval. And in the middle of the night, Gerhard Miller had a problem and went upside down on the trioval and disappeared up toward NASCAR turn 1, isn't it? Upside down, spraying oil and dust and all over the track. And when I arrived, I could see nothing. It was about midnight. I drove into it, fortunately came out the other side. And then after that, my co-driver, Nierpasch, was taken ill. And so suddenly I was all on my own with no co-driver. Well, Miller was out of the race, so Rushka van Hanstein, the team manager at Porsche then, said, well, okay, Prof. Stommelen, who was really Miller's co-driver, he can join you and become your co-driver. So that meant there were now 3 of us that had driven the car. We carried on, and Joe Siffert had some and led most of the way. We were second most of the way. And when we got to early, or towards a couple of hours from the end of the race, Von Hanstein came over to me and he said, you know, Joe Siffert and Hans have had some problems. They had problems with the gearbox. The car had dropped back about 3 laps. So instead of leading all the way, they were now second. And he said, would you let Joe and Hans maybe drive a couple of laps in your car so you can all be credited with the victory? First one for Porsche. So I said, yeah, of course, no problem. So Hans and Joe came and did a couple of laps each. And then Stommelen and I carried on, finished, I won the race, and there was a classic photograph that I'm sure everybody here has seen, with 3 907s crossing the line side by side. And fortunately, I'm sure it was pure luck, but Bill France had come up with a huge winner's wreath, which was big enough to get all 5 of us in.
Well, next year Porsche came back with the 908, and every one of them failed. They had tower shafts failed. That's the heat treatment. They went from dominating the race in was it 67, Steve, and then having the embarrassment of having all the cars break the ball here.
Well, we went literally from 0 to 0, and that following year, Brian and I drove together. We were driving 908s, and as you said, all of them had some particular problem, and we all had the same problem. Brian had his own little problem in the middle of the night. After the international hairpin, it used to be actually much further down that way. So after we come through the hairpin and we were going back in this direction, it was a lot longer and therefore a lot faster. And when we got to the end, or when Brian got to the end, pouring rain in the middle of the night, and the fire extinguisher went off in the car. He couldn't see anything, slid off the road, and spent an hour out there in the mud trying to get it all back together again. Only to get back to the pit area, and then have us all retire later on.
Brian, while you got the mic, also tell about how you got first and second in the 917.
Well, just going back to this 69 in the 908, in 68, in May of 68, in the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa-Francorchamps, in my Cooper Grand Prix car, the suspension broke. I had a really enormous accident, and I went right into a marshal's post. The car was 3 wheels, and I almost had my arm torn off. And I went racing again in November in South Africa. The arm was hurting. I went to see a Johannesburg surgeon, and this was 6 weeks from Daytona. I said, I have to be at Daytona in 6 weeks. And he did an emergency repair, and he took bone out of my hip, glued it in place on my right forearm. And when I arrived at Daytona, I just took a sling off. I didn't tell anybody, but I drove with one hand all the time, with my wheel, my hand against the knee like that. And I was praying that the car would break down, and it did.
Well, Ben, you went up in the Martini 917 and won Sebring with Gerard LaRousse. Compare and contrast Sebring to Daytona in the same car.
Well, it actually wasn't the same car. It was a 907. But before we leave Daytona, like Arturio, I used to get on very well with Old France. We became very good friends. And I came back, in fact, and drove a bigger American car, a little bit differently. I actually came back and drove a stock car in the what was then the Firecracker 400 in July. No, I actually came back and did the Daytona 500. In 1969, I finished 11th in the Dodge, and then I came back a couple of years later and finished 10th in the 500 as well. Then we went on to Sebring, as you said. It was totally different. You know, here the 907 was a little tiny car, wasn't really very quick. It only did probably 185 miles an hour on the straight. And by the time we got to the 917s, by the time we got into 1970 and 1971, the 917 was a wonderful car to drive. It was, I wouldn't say it was easy, but it wasn't that difficult. It did everything right. It didn't make any mistakes, as long as the driver didn't make them. And driving at Sebring was really no big problem. Gerard LaRousse and I just sort of trundled around and we won. The really big excitement was at Sebring for me the year before, when I was also driving a 917, and on the way down to the hairpin at one point, early on, this was on Saturday afternoon, there was a 911 in front of me, and I hesitated about going past and decided I'd wait. So when he drove around the corner behind him, accelerated after the hairpin, I had Joe Samposi behind me in a 512 Ferrari, and in front of us a little red Italian car. That's all we could remember. And as we approached the little red Italian car, there was enough room for me to quickly go left and right and go up behind him and in front of the Porsche 911, but as I was about to do that, the little red Italian car put the brakes on. So I tried to get through the gap, which was getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and the Porsche 911 took my entire rear corner off. I made it back to the pits. Samposi and I then spent an hour trying to find our driver of the little red car, but without success. But we had a big one here also. The following year, in 1971, in the middle of the night, as I said, there were no lights around here, except here in the triangle. And we didn't have the Mickey Mouse chicane on the back straight either. So we used to come down the back straight, and in the 917, we would go on to the east banking flat out at about 220 miles an hour. And what we used to do was try and recognize the helmet of whoever was driving in front to see what he was going to be doing. At one point, about the middle of the night, almost midnight, I went up onto the banking, nothing in front of me, and I'm just driving around the banking at about 220 miles an hour, and suddenly there wasn't even a noise. Suddenly, like that, the car changed ends and was spinning. Well, one of the things that had happened earlier when I came and did my first stock car race, Richard Petty was responsible for introducing the rookies into stock car procedure at Daytona. And he said, on the banking, anything goes wrong, turn left, put your foot on the brake, You can close your eyes if you like, but that's optional. And the car will just spin down the banking. Well, I spun for around 400 yards around the banking, having done everything said. The first time around, I saw the wall go in the lights, and then a couple of seconds later, the wall went past again. But he was right, it was getting further away each time. And I eventually stopped down on the grass, and what had happened was the right rear wheel had actually dragged the tyre off into the wheel well, into the wheel, and I just started spinning. The whole rear end had gone to right, the wheel, the drive shaft, the first time around the rear bodywork, which was made to go 200 miles an hour forward, not backwards. That came off, then one door, then the other door, and I finally stopped down on the grass. Racing drivers are cowards. So the first thing was I got out of the car, looked around to the far side in which direction I should run. But I couldn't see any lights, so I had to wait until the lights arrived. And a couple of pairs of lights arrived on the back straight, went into the fog and the smoke and the mist that I left behind. One of them was Mark Donoghue in the Penske 512 Ferrari. The other one was a guy in a 911 Porsche. They hit each other, and then the 911 followed the exact same trajectory that I had done and came all the way down and hit the right rear of my 917, launching him into the air until he landed upside down. By the time he landed, I was already there to see what help I could give. The mechanics and the marshals were already at my car and saying, "There's no driver. Where's the driver? We've lost the driver." And eventually found both me and the guy in the 911. We introduced ourselves in the ambulance on the way to the medical unit, and that was the end of my 24 hours in 1971.
You're at the driver's school in 1961. Started racing a driver. Did you ever think back then your life and career would involve the highest levels of endurance racing?
No, I really didn't. Is this thing working?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I didn't pay much attention to that. I had eyes towards Grand National racing down here in the southeast. One thing I've concluded after listening to all of these guys talking about their experiences with the Porsche, I should have started in a Porsche instead of a Triumph. I probably would have been right along with them. Anyhow,
Well, you drove a 911 here one time with
Bruce Jennings.
Bruce Jennings.
Yeah. But I had to drive incognito.
Yeah. You told me you didn't, and I had a photo of you doing it, so you had to admit it, right?
Well, I started in a Tier 3, and actually, an interesting little thing, they had practice races during the driver's school, and I was fortunate enough to win my first race, which was in driver's school, and I had the good fortune of winning my last race, which was the Canon GT finale in 1986 with my friend Chip Robinson, and it was my last race, so having won the first and last was quite a personal accomplishment.
The trademark of Group 44, the reversed fours, how'd that come about?
Well, it's not very exciting. I had a lady friend cutting out the numbers one time when we were going off to Mine Rock to a race, and she put the pattern on the contact paper upside down. And as a result, the number came out backwards, and all I had was enough contact paper for 8 numbers. And so I put it on the deck lid, and I had trouble getting through scrutineering, but I did pass. And the next thing I knew, there was a picture of the car somewhere, and it showed the backwards forward, and there was a caption underneath the picture that said, "No, we didn't reverse the negative by accident. That's the way it stood." And it stayed that way for the rest of its life. And if you look closely, I believe they're backwards on...
On the rear deck and on the wing, yeah.
No, underneath the wing.
On the side wings, too.
Yes. Yeah. It became a trademark that you hardly ever forgotten because they said, who's that idiot that put those backwards words on there?
It didn't so bad getting the decals on backwards as getting the embroidery shop to embroider them backwards. I can guess that.
Anyhow.
Now you did a stock car race at one time.
Well, that's kind of an interesting story. Yes, I did actually several of them. Bill, I drove a road race with Buck Baker at Road Atlantic, and I drove with Buck Baker, a senior Buck Baker, not Buddy, with a Cortina here in the 12R. But the stock car race that you're referring to was a result of my friendship with Big Bill. And I won a Trans Am race here in 1967, which was interesting. And Mr. France decided that it would be appropriate for me to have a stock car ride. And he found a local guy, his name was Vernon Blank, who had a Pontiac, and he had no driver for it. So that all went on, and it was all a publicity stunt from Bill's viewpoint because he had arranged to have an all-girl pit crew with the mayor of Daytona as the fuel man. Anyhow, we never got to the race, which was a bit unfortunate, but I did the first 5 or 10 laps in the car, and they were qualifying in those days, I think about $1.80 maybe or something like that. And I came in after doing about 6 or 8 laps, and came over. The owner came over to the car, and he was all excited. He said because I came within 4 or 5 miles an hour of the going rate, and he said to me, "When you get used to it and be able to really get after it, we're going to be in good shape." And I said, "Vernon, there ain't no more." All the way around with your foot in it, ain't no more.
One of the times in the 24-hour, you had an anxious one of the SGR5s with the tire.
Now we lost a tire going down the back straight, and it wound up on fire, and I had a tough time exiting the car, but I did get out, and I didn't get burned at all, except for a couple spots on my left hand. But the most difficult part was my mother was home watching the race, and it showed me on fire big time, and I didn't know she was watching the race, so somebody had to tell me the next day, so I had to call her up and tell her it was no big deal.
Group 44 was always famous for the pristine nature of the crew. Everybody was dressed properly, everything was pressed. There was a discipline in it that you brought that no one else had at that time in SCCA. You were quite a disciplinarian.
Well, I don't know about that because I was doing what came naturally. You started out by saying something else that I wanted to comment about. What did you say about that?
Oh, you talked about the oil cooler being taken out by the tire.
Oh yeah, well that was because that was the fire. But
well, the pristine nature of all.
Oh yeah, well. I've always said, and when I was pressurized into talking about the cars, we didn't win all the races we would like to have, but we did win, I think, 11 or 12 of the GTB races over a period of 3 or 4 years. We finished second 9 times one year, which was another example of my misfortune of not having started out in a Porsche. But we didn't win all the races that we would like to win, but we did win all the beauty contests.
Sean, your record, as young as you are, I was reviewing 171 races, you won 74 times, 118 podium finishes, 47 poles, and 70 fastest laps. How old are you? 19. Man, that's phenomenal. Congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah, I've been lucky to be in good cars everywhere I've gone, whether it's stock cars or Formula cars. I've been really fortunate and had a lot of good people around me and a lot of good teams.
Well, I think you make it luck. And you earn it. It's not something you... I've seen guys in really great cars who work really fast. And I've seen it the other way around.
They say you'd rather be lucky than good any day, and I stick to that.
I've gone through life proving that myself. Ricky and Jordan, I don't know who to go to first. Probably Ricky, you're the oldest, right?
Yeah.
How is it to drive for Dad?
It's brutal. This is my 4th year, and you know, I think anyone in a family business can relate, and I think you can just multiply that by 10 when you get to a racetrack, and you know, you got all that pressure of a race weekend, and results are really important, but now having Jordan on the team, it kind of shares the pain with me. So the yelling is kind of dispersed throughout.
I was with Bobby Rahal recently up at the Simeon Museum, and I asked him the question from the other angle. How is it being the father and the team owner and team manager of your son driving? He said, you just got to define it as it's 2 different jobs and 2 different relationships.
Yeah, he does a good job of that, and Jordan and I both try to earn our spot on merit and not, you know, as our dad is the team owner, and he treats us the same way. He doesn't give us any breaks. He's pretty hard on us. He tells us if we do something wrong, and we're forced to listen because he's got a lot of experience as well.
Now, Ricky, did you follow in your brother's footsteps, or you followed your father's footsteps? What drove you to get into racing?
We both followed my dad's footsteps. When we started racing, he was racing 333 at the time, just getting into the Cadillac LMP program, and we shared a go-kart. Me and Jordan. He would do a race 1 month, I would do it the next month, and it just really wasn't that serious. And then eventually he retired for the first of 3 times, and he was able to spend more time with us. We got our own go-kart and started, really developing a passion for the sport.
Jordan, where do you see your career going?
I'm pretty happy right now. I mean, doing the IMSA series here, the 24-hour here, and doing Le Mans every year with Corvette Racing. I mean, it's kind of hard to believe I'm already doing what I dreamt to do. So, I mean, sports car racing was always the passion. Watching my dad, watching all these guys, hearing the stories are unbelievable. You usually read them in books, so to hear them in person is really cool. But I mean, to win Daytona, win Le Mans, win all those big ones is the goal.
Le Mans versus Daytona, do you have a preference?
Well, Daytona's kind of our home race. We live 45 minutes away. We finished second the last 2 years here, so I think that's the first one on the list.
Where do you see the future? Do you see anything outside of sports car racing? Or is it good?
I mean, right now we're in competitive cars, both here and at Le Mans, so I think while we have something that we're comfortable with associated with the manufacturer, with Chevrolet, it's hard to really pass that up right now. If something had to come up, in IndyCar or NASCAR, it'd always have to be the right opportunity, not jumping into just any program you get offered. So I think if we're running up front in sports cars, that's the place to be.
Brian Rubin, I can come back to you for a minute. You, as I said earlier, you're the only person ever to finish first and second in the same race on the same team. How did that come about?
In 1970, in the 1917 Golf cars run by John Wyatt, for some reason, Joseph, my co-driver, and I had trouble right from about the 3rd hour. It started with me whistling down the back straight at about 200 miles an hour. There were a bunch of Trans Am type cars, Camaros and Mustangs, and there were 4 or 5 of them. They were racing together. There was just room in between, so I go, wah, there's the in between. And just as I got to the front, my left rear tyre burst, and it did a lot of damage. It damaged the oil tank, the bodywork, and we lost about 25 minutes. And the next thing Vic was talking about spinning. Well, that helped at the back there. We were certainly doing like 214 miles an hour, and about 2 in the morning, the right rear suspension fell off, a bolt broke in the suspension. I spun all the way down here without hitting anything, got back to the pits, and we lost another 25 minutes. And then we had a fuel leak and lost about 20 minutes. And then, at about 6 in the morning, the clutch failed, and the car was pushed away. And the German engineers said to our team, of course they're English mechanics, you can change the clutch in 1 hour. So our guys got to work, and they changed the clutch. They'd never done it before, in about 1 hour and 5 minutes. And so during that time, John Wyer said to me, have a go in the Rodriguez car, because Pedro Rodriguez's co-driver, Leo Kinnunen, was Finnish, and he didn't speak any English, and they couldn't make him understand the pace that they wanted the car to run. It was miles in the lead. So I'm whistling around in this Rodriguez Kinnunen car, and suddenly Joe Sibbett comes hurtling past me, waving like this. And so, you know, I think we took second place from Jackie Hicks and Mario Andretti in the factory Ferrari 512 with about 30 minutes to go, and so that's how we finished first and second.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have time for a couple of questions. If anybody has questions, if you'll identify yourself, we'll get a microphone over to you. It's always the guy on the top row, right? You don't have to sit on the top row here. I mean, the cars don't come that close to the fence.
Mr. Brennan, 1981, you, Bob Garrison, and Bobby Rahal. You won 24 hours of Daytona. Would you say that it was the pace at which you drove, or was it the speed of the car?
It was the pace that we drove at, which was very carefully. We had one problem during the 24 hours. We had a mechanic who's here this weekend, Greg Eliff, and he's a kind of big, heavy-built, you know, easy-going guy and not moving too quick. Well, we had an exhaust header broke at about 2 in the morning, and he shot under the back of this red-hot car, and he's shouting for wrenches and parts, and we were going again in 15 minutes. He changed the entire exhaust header, which was red-hot. So if Greg's here tonight, thank you very much, Greg. That was the only problem we had during the race.
Any other questions? Got one right down here in the front row. Hey, where?
What's your favorite race car that you ever drove, and what's the one that you hated the most or scared you the most?
All right, we'll start with the Taylor.
Nearly as exciting as theirs.
The best car is a Chevrolet powered car, right?
Exactly.
There you go.
I think the one that I want to drive the most is the one my dad always talks about, the Chevy Intrepid from the GTP era. So that would be my favorite.
Ricky?
Yeah, there's a couple 333 SPs here this weekend, and that sound is just unbelievable. I'd love to drive one of those one day. But the car that scared me the most was a super late model on third, and it wasn't a very comforting experience. But yeah, I mean, lucky enough to drive, you know, Daytona prototypes, which would be a lot of fun.
Sean?
What he just said was his scariest, was my favorite. It was a super late model on dirt. And least favorite was the SRA Radical that I drove this year at Spring Mountain, and I felt like I was committing suicide by getting in the car.
Bob? The best and the worst.
The best? Well, there was two bests. Obviously, I enjoyed driving those cars, but our TR8 was a great race car, the one that you have, as a matter of fact. And we won a lot of races and beat all the Corvettes, which was really the best thing they had. The worst car, believe it or not, was a Ferrari. I drove a factory Ferrari here in, I don't recall the year, but it was the worst car, scared me half to death. The front end wouldn't stay on the ground going down the front straight. Had to back off, coming off of turn 4 in order to get through the kink. And I started the car, and I finished my stint, and a Frenchman who I don't recall his name, got in the car after I was in, and coming off of turn 4 on his third lap, blew a right rear tire, and the only thing that was left was the cockpit in which the Frenchman was sitting. All 4 corners are gone, including the engine.
Vic, best and worst. Oh, I know what the worst is.
The best is actually very easy. I'm often asked this question. The reply is simply the 917, which leads to the next immediate question, which one? And the answer is all of them. Even the very first almost undrivable monster in 1969 I loved because it was so much quicker than everything else. Even then, though it wandered all over the road, it was about 25 miles an hour quicker than anything else at Le Mans. And then the long tail, the following year, the very first long tail that you saw in Steve McQueen's film, that was great because it did almost 250 miles an hour. It was the first one to go around Le Mans at an average of over 150 miles an hour in that car. The worst one, that's easy. The little tiny shadow with wheels like cotton reels that was an absolute nasty, horrible monster. Jackie Oliver drove it once and said never again. George Foreman drove it once and said never again. And I was foolish enough to drive it once and I said never again.
You know, that car is owned by Harm Lagai, the chief designer of Porsche, who thought it was the greatest Can-Am car of all time.
Yeah, but he's now changed. Unfortunately, as a historic car, I think it should have been left as it was, and he should suffer if he wanted to drive it. But he's actually totally changed it, and you can't even recognize it. Doesn't even look like it did.
Brian?
Can you hear? Yeah. I thought there was, you know, the original 917, as Mick mentioned, in 1969, was unbelievably bad. It was terrible. At Le Mans, I went to a Le Mans test in 1969 and I drove a 917. I got fastest time, but I'm all over the road, down the North Straight. There's no chicanes. It's doing 220 miles an hour. It just goes from one side to the other like this. And you hoped when you arrived at the King that you were on the left-hand side of the road. In 1969, the first private owner to buy a 917, John Wolfe, his co-driver, Digby Martin, spun in a straight line as he went over the Mont-Saint-Bernard. In a 917, he spun all the way down to the Mont-Saint corner, drove it back to the pits, got out, went up to John Wolfe, he said, "Thank you very much, John. I have now retired from motor racing." And he never raced again. And the three English drivers in the Porsche team, Vic Elford, myself, and Richard Atwood, we all went to John Wolfe, the owner. We said, "John, let Herbert Linney start. He was the Porsche factory test driver." "No, it's my car. I'm starting." And he was killed on the first lap when he lost control of the White House corner. What I really disliked about the 917, even the later models, was that if you hit something hard enough, it broke in half across the cockpit. That's what I didn't like. I know of 5, and I know there were more than that. Best sports car, probably the Ferrari 312 PB that I drove with Arturo. The gearbox was like a little jewel. You couldn't move the lever too fast, and you couldn't miss a gear. You just went whap, whap, whap. The engine was fantastic. In 1972, we won every race except Le Mans, where we didn't go. Thank you.
Jerry?
Well, me, I think 2 things. One, driving the Jaguar was great. The V12 sounded so good, and the throttle response was terrific. And driving for Group 44 was the best team I ever drove for. As far as a pure car, I'd have to say the Nissan was really, really good. It had tons of torque and a lot of power, and they had no turbo lag. It was a turbo. It was one of the first cars that I heard about that virtually had no lag because of the electronic system that Don Deversorts had developed for it.
You had about 1,100 horsepower.
Well, at times, yeah. It was a spectacular car.
Andy?
Well, I think mine's quite an interesting one. I've been thinking, sitting here, what would I pick as the best car, and I've driven loads of very, very good cars, been very lucky that way. But I have to say, in all honesty, the car I'm driving this weekend, the Audi R8 LMP1 car, the champion car, that is a fantastic car. And every time I sit back in that car and drive it, of course I drove it in period in the early 2000s, but sitting in it this weekend, what a fantastic car. I can't come up with the worst car. I've been thinking for the last 15 minutes and I can't find one.
You've been lucky.
Well, I've driven some bad ones, but I can't think of one that I would single out.
Per me la vettura più performante è stata l'Alfa Romeo 33, in quanto l'ingegnere Kitty me l'ha costruita come un sarto cuce un abito a una persona, me l'ha costruita addosso, per cui io facevo fare tutto quello che volevo. mentre posso dire che la macchina più difficoltosa da guidare è stata invece la prima Ferrari B3 Formula 1 detta Spazzaneve, che è stata veramente catastrofica.
Arturo says that for him the best car he had, the most versatile and easy to drive, and which he won a lot of World Championship races and actually 2 World Championships. This was the Alpha 33 that engineer Kitty basically he says built around him. And so this was for him the best car he drove. The worst was probably the Ferrari Formula 1, the first B3 prototype with a flat nose called Spazzaneve in Italian, that means snowmobile, that it was very, very difficult to drive.
Well, I have to echo what Bob Tullia said. I've had the pleasure of racing his TR8, and it is the finest race car I ever drove. And just as a matter of interest, the worst race car I ever drove was a Chevelle in a hobby class. I won the race, and I told my wife I got to keep racing. She said, "Why?" I said, "I can't go through life knowing the last race I ran was in Patsy's Cotton Girl Chevelle." Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us this evening. Big hand for the panel.
Okay, good evening, everybody. The second part of this evening's entertainment will be here in the fan zone where everybody's having this delicious barbecue dinner. Bill Patterson doing his live painting here. Cars that have been racing at Daytona this weekend, including the 962, WeatherTech Porsche, the Action Express prototype, Daytona prototype, and the 911 in red tag. Bill will finish that up. We'll have an award. We have a Workers' Choice Award. We have a Sportsmanship Spirit of Daytona, Spirit of the Classic 24-Hour Award. So please don't leave, stay around, get some food, have a few drinks. We will be back in a moment. We also have the HSR House Band, the Stepping Stones, and I guarantee you will love them.